Is it just me, or do you also sit at the computer on Tuesdays, listening to the Supreme Court arguments while practicing your deep breathing exercises? Just me, probably. My name is Brittany Page, and this is The Page Perspective. Today, we are talking to a former guest on my podcast, I Doubt It podcast, Jesse Rabinowitz. And we're talking to him about an upcoming case before the Supreme Court, a case that will present yet another opportunity to practice your deep breathing exercises, but also one that has been said that will have a significant impact on the issue of homelessness, the most significant impact on the issue of homelessness in decades, in fact. Specifically, they're looking at the question of whether cities can punish unhoused people who are forced into the streets when they have nowhere else to go. Last year, Jesse Rabinowitz came on I Doubt It podcast to discuss his work advocating for solutions to end the homelessness crisis in this country, but he has a whole new role now. Jesse Rabinowitz joined the National Law Center in October 2023 as the Campaign and Communications Director. Previously, he was the Senior Manager for Policy and Advocacy at Miriam's Kitchen, a DC-based nonprofit working to end long-term homelessness. During his 8 years at Miriam's Kitchen, Jesse managed the Way Home campaign, a coalition of over 110 organizations and 7,000 voters working to end chronic homelessness in DC, which has won funding to end chronic homelessness for over 6,000 individuals. Jesse's work has been featured in various media outlets, including The Washington Post, NPR, The Guardian, and USA Today. So he's the perfect person to talk to about this case, which will be before the Supreme Court on April 22nd. Without further delay, here's my conversation with Jesse Rabinowitz. Jesse Rabinowitz, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Brittany.
So we have a big case to talk about. It's funny that I'm talking to you today about a Supreme Court case that's coming up when we just had another big Supreme Court case today. But the Supreme Court has decided to take up the case of City of Grants Pass, Oregon versus Johnson. And it's a case that's going to have a significant impact on homelessness, specifically on the people who are experiencing homelessness, who are unsheltered, living on the streets. And I'm wondering if, just for people who haven't heard about this case, who may be hearing about this for the first time, what is the case? What's at stake in this case?
Yeah, we know that a lot of stuff is happening at the Supreme Court this month and even this week, as you mentioned. And this is the most important case about homelessness to reach the Supreme Court in about 40 years. And it asks the fundamental question, does the Constitution protect people experiencing homelessness or not? The city of Grants Pass, Oregon is pretty small. There are about 44,000 people who live there. And like most small towns in America, the population has doubled in the past few decades, but the supply of housing has not. So There's only a 1% vacancy rating, which means there's not only no affordable housing, there's just no housing. Grants Pass also has a history of racism. It's a former sundown town, and we know that people of color are disproportionately impacted by homelessness. And then Grants Pass, also like many other small towns, has no shelter. There's a gospel rest commission that folks can stay in that sometimes is referred to as shelter, but as you'll see in a moment, it's not. In order to stay there, you have to be sober. You have to go to Christian church services twice a day. You have to pay $100 a month to live there. And you have to work for the mission 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. So if you're too elderly or too sick to meet that work requirement, you can't stay there, which means because, again, there's no housing and there's no shelter, people end up living outside. And instead of responding to an increase in unsheltered homelessness with things that work, like housing or shelter, the city of Grants Pass decided to respond with $300 tickets. We know that folks staying outside don't often have $300 lying around. So people's tickets were unpaid and ruining their credit scores and sometimes even leading to arrest. The brave folks experiencing homelessness in Grants Pass sued the city of Grants Pass, and every court that has heard the case thus far have agreed that punishing someone for camping, for sleeping outside when they have nowhere else to go, is a violation of the Constitution's protection against cruel and unusual punishment. It's important to note that Grants Pass took an incredibly expansive definition of camping. So we're literally talking about people using something like a pillow or a blanket I've been thinking a lot about how cruel it is to make someone force. I've been thinking about how cruel it is to force someone to choose whether they want to risk a ticket and use a blanket when it's snowing or be forced to stay outside without any protection. That is not how we end homelessness. So on April 22nd, the Supreme Court is going to take up this case that fundamentally asks, are people living outside protected by the Constitution?
Yeah, when you talked about that expansive definition of camping and how it involves a pillow and a blanket, and I started thinking about some of the news headlines that I've been seeing of notable figures who are members of the Democratic Party or who consider themselves to be on the left. I'm thinking of San Francisco's District Attorney Brooke Jenkins, who was recently in the headlines because she said that we need to make life for people who are living on the streets more uncomfortable in order to get them off the streets. And I guess I'm wondering, this is kind of maybe a general question that's not specific to the case, but given your work in the field, what is it that you think has people growing sympathetic of this argument that you need to make people, quote unquote, uncomfortable, as if they're not already uncomfortable and living a very difficult life on the street? What is it that is having people be pulled toward this thinking?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are two things. One is this myth that people are choosing to be homeless. And one is the fact that there is a coordinated right-wing billionaire-backed effort to criminalize homelessness across the country, primarily led by the Cicero Institute. Florida just passed last week a state camping ban that would criminalize homelessness. Any day now, Kentucky will sign into law, maybe not sign into law because it's going to get vetoed. Any day now, Kentucky will pass a law that not only criminalizes homelessness and guts funding for housing, but enables people to enact a stand your ground provision to use force and even deadly force to remove homeless people from their property. These are the same folks that are in part behind the Supreme Court case. None of this is happening by accident. There is a growing movement of folks who believe we can punish our way out of homelessness, and that's simply not true.
Yeah, it's a scary climate.
It's terrifying. And to be super clear, this law in Kentucky will get people killed and will get Black and brown people killed. And the other factor that I think is underlying this is this belief that homelessness is a choice and that people are choosing to be homeless. I have worked in homeless services for a decade and have done things like homeless street outreach and worked in meal centers and drop-in centers. I've never met anybody who has experienced homelessness by choice. I've never met anyone who says, when I grow up, I want to be homeless. People are experiencing homelessness because our elected officials have failed to do the hard work of governing and leading and are now blaming people for being poor.
Right. And there's a key aspect of this case. The case, it's based on a decision of the Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, which followed a precedent that said states cannot criminalize the act of sleeping outside. And there's a key phrase here: if no inside space is available. And this kind of gets back to what you were talking about with the shelter system. And I think many people hear these cases and they say, well, if there is shelter space, what's wrong with forcing someone off the street to go into a shelter? Can you talk a little bit about what you might say to people who make that argument?
Sure. I think we first have to be super clear that this case is not about the cities that have extra shelter. This is like cities like Grants Pass that have literally no accessible shelter beds. And also in cities out west, shelters are crowded, shelters are dangerous, shelters are unsafe. COVID showed us what people living in shelters have been saying for a long time, that germs and disease spread in these crowded conditions really quickly. I wouldn't want to live in a room with 80 other people where you often can't bring in your pet, you often can't stay with your spouse, you often can only bring 2 bags. What we also saw during the pandemic was all of these people who had been labeled shelter resistant were given the opportunity to stay in a hotel. And they took that opportunity quickly. Once they got into the hotel rooms, they stabilized and got healthy again. This shows us that people aren't shelter resistant. The current shelter system is people resistant.
Mm-hmm. So this is another one of those myths, it seems like, that's popping up, is people believing that people want to be outside and they're choosing to be outside. And I guess the act of criminalizing homelessness fits in with this myth because they believe that by, I guess, threatening jail time or threatening ticketing, threatening fines, that somehow that's going to mobilize someone who is living on the street to quote unquote choose a different path. And that's fundamentally just not the case, right?
It's just not true that people are choosing to live outside. The city of Grants Pass was quite clear in the legal filing that their goal is to make homelessness so uncomfortable that people move on down the road. But we know that study after study shows people experience homelessness in the cities and towns where they live, where they have connections and where they have community. So this idea that we're going to force people to uproot their lives and live somewhere else is counterfactual and displaces people from the communal support systems that they know and need.
And we see that often in these efforts to quote unquote clean up encampments, right? Where they will go in, throw away people's belongings, throw away their tents, throw away their medications, and then they just get displaced and have to go set up another area where they are then again living outside. And then they just kind of kick the can down the road and there's no solution there. It seems to be that this is becoming more common. And I'm wondering how much of it is cities, elected officials not wanting to actually grapple with the solutions to the problem because those solutions are much more difficult than simply grasping at criminalization of homelessness.
Yeah, I think sadly politicians across the country and of every political party continue to take the easy way out. Criminalizing homelessness does make homelessness disappear in that one particular area, right? You can get rid of that tent, but you're not getting rid of that person. That person is still experiencing homelessness. It's time for our elected officials to actually do their jobs instead of displacing people and pushing homelessness further into the shadows. They need to do the hard work of governing and actually pass bills and laws and budgets that end homelessness. You brought up another important point, which is that this focus on fines, sweeps, criminalization not only does nothing to end homelessness, but actually makes homelessness harder. We've talked to folks who have been arrested 20 to 30 times only because they've experienced homelessness. The only reason they have a criminal record is because they were homeless. Now, when they go try to apply for a job or apply for housing, their record comes up and they're denied that housing or a job. People who have unpaid tickets are not able to pay them and their credit scores are ruined, which makes it harder for them to find a job or housing. I know as an outreach worker that when I had clients who were displaced from their encampment, I couldn't find them to connect them with services. This happens all across the country. I think many people don't want to see homelessness. I know I don't want to see folks living outside. You don't want to see folks living outside. And most importantly, the people living outside don't want to live outside. But our elected officials have focused on the one thing we know doesn't work instead of actually funding the housing and supportive services that work time and time again to end homelessness. When someone has an apartment that meets their needs, they don't live outside anymore, and the entire community is healthier and safer for it.
Yeah. You talked about some of the implications here, and if the Supreme Court rules in favor of the city of Grants Pass, this is going to criminalize unsheltered homelessness. And I guess, what are the implications of the Supreme Court making such a ruling for, all of the states across the country?
To be clear, this would open up the state's ability to further criminalize homelessness, but just like we've seen in Dobbs, states could decline to criminalize homelessness. States could pass statewide laws that say criminalizing homelessness is not a value of our state. I actually think the example to point to is Miami. Miami was under a consent decree that took the ability to criminalize homelessness out of their toolbox. But the city still wanted to respond to homelessness, so Miami funded housing and supportive services and reduced homelessness by more than half, all without arresting people. When they were funding housing and services, homelessness went down. When that consent decree expired and they began criminalizing homelessness again, homelessness went up. There is a recent study out that looks at 100 cities that have passed no camping bans, and on average in those cities, homelessness goes up. There's so much proof that punishing people for being poor pushes them further into poverty and doesn't actually end homelessness. it's time for us to actually address the underlying issue of what's happening here, which is that in Grants Pass and across the country, half of renters simply can't pay rent. And when people can't pay rent, they end up living outside.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about those solutions, right? Because I think that you've made it very clear criminalization is not a solution. It only makes the problem worse. People are getting charges on their record that then interfere with their ability to get a job, which interferes with your ability to make money, which makes it impossible for you to find housing, right? It's just this downward spiral. What are some of those solutions that elected officials should be reaching for, should be prioritizing, and as you encourage them to move away from this criminalization?
Absolutely. I think the first thing we're asking elected officials to do is not make homelessness worse. Stop criminalizing homelessness. If there are concerns about the ways folks are living outside, address those concerns. Put in porta potties, put in hand washing stations, have regular trash pickups, increase skilled homeless street outreach workers. All of those things are good. And despite what many cities and states said around this court case, they can still do that. All of the court case says right now is that they can't punish people for being poor. But in addition to meeting people's basic needs, we know that housing first works. In DC, over 95% of people in permanent supportive housing using a housing first approach stay housed after their first year. These programs work, they save money, and they enable people to get their health in check, reconnect with family, find employment. These programs work across the country, and it's time for our elected officials to actually fund them at scale.
I guess just taking your general temperature, how are you feeling? How are your colleagues feeling as the date that this case moves closer to becoming before the Supreme Court? Like, how are you guys just feeling about the odds that there will be a win in your favor?
I believe in organizing from a place of hope and optimism, and we certainly see a path towards victory. We can't pretend to even predict what's going on in the minds of the Supreme Court justices, but we think they will.
I wish you could. I wish you could.
I know. We know that every court that has heard this decision before has agreed that punishing people experiencing homelessness for using a pillow or a blanket is cruel and unusual. And this is really the textbook definition of cruel and unusual punishment. And we think that will be reflected in the oral arguments on the 22nd. And we feel that there's a path towards victory in this case.
If someone's listening to this and they are feeling fearful about yet another instance of a case going before the Supreme Court where, a handful of unelected judges are yet again deciding our fundamental rights, what would you say to them to encourage them to get involved, to encourage them to channel that fear into something productive that can make a difference? What can people do?
We are growing the movement that knows that criminalization makes homelessness worse and housing ends homelessness. So we encourage folks to visit our website, www.johnsonvgrantspass.com, which has all sorts of resources about this case, more background on the case. And there's also a link to register for our in-person rally in DC on April 22nd. We expect hundreds of advocates from around the country to be there with us outside of the Supreme Court building to show the Supreme Court and Congress and the White House that we are fired up and we are going to continue not only to fight against criminalization, but for the housing that we know ends homelessness. What we also know, though, is that even if we win this case, which again, we think is possible, the Supreme Court will not create any housing or any shelter. We need folks to work with and to pressure their elected officials on the local, state, and federal levels to actually fund the housing that's needed to end homelessness.
I think that's such an important point because it represents what you said earlier, organizing from a place of optimism. And when people are given practical ways that they can make a difference and get involved, I think it goes a long way to increasing that feeling of hope. I'm also thinking of your last time when you were here on the show, although it was, I doubt it, podcast, a different form of the show, but I was still there. And we always end those conversations asking people, what's the most recent thing that you've changed your mind about? And I'm not going to ask you that again because you already answered it. And if people want to know what you said, they can go in and watch that episode. But You're out there doing this work. You're educating people on the issue of homelessness. You're out there working to change hearts and minds. You're out there trying to make a difference and trying to improve this situation. And I guess I'm wondering, just generally speaking, what have you found useful in your work to educate people? What have you found is useful in helping people see the truth of the matter here? What is helpful in having people change their minds? What are some tools that you use to help you in that way?
I think so much of this persuasion and change work comes down to authentic relationships and having long conversations with folks who are open to thinking about things differently. It's been very important for me to figure out how I am spending my time and energy. I'm no longer interested in trying to convince someone who thinks that people experience homelessness belong in jail. They're not going to change their minds. I'm more interested in influencing the folks who kind of get that it's messed up that we're using the criminal legal system to punish folks experiencing homelessness, but aren't sure that there's a solution, or folks who agree with us but aren't aware of ways to plug in. I think if we strategically spend our energy on folks who are not with us yet, but are not against us, and spend our energy on folks that are movable and that are compassionate, we can continue to build the power that we need to end homelessness. I think far too often we stay in our own bubbles and only talk to people that agree with us in ways that alienate other folks. But as we're seeing, and as a Harvard study showed recently, half of American renters are paying more than they can afford on rent. The timing is, this is the exact time we need to build wide coalitions of folks who recognize that housing is too expensive, and when housing is too expensive, folks live outside. And the solution to all of this is housing and a functioning safety net that meets everybody's needs.
So it seems like this idea that many people are in a predicament where they are not too far away from those people that they may see as different or other who happen to be living on the street, that, many people are in a situation of financial precarity where they could have an emergency come up, they could have something unexpected come up, a healthcare expense, and maybe this idea that people are starting to see that they're not that different from those people who have experienced those same things who end up on the street, and getting to those people and their compassion. And as you say it, the people who are reachable on these issues seems to be the important thing.
I think so. And I think it's so clear to most decent people that someone sleeping outside in the middle of a snowstorm using a blanket or a sleeping bag shouldn't go to jail because of it. And that's the bare minimum that we are hoping the court adopts through this process.
Yeah. Well, I guess we will see what the justices have to say about that. April 22nd, you said, right?
The oral arguments are April 22nd. The last day of the court term is June 30th, and we're expecting this to be one of the later rulings. So folks should check out our website, www.johnsonvgrants.com, to learn more, plug in, and also find ways that you can support. We have a social media toolkit. We're launching a video campaign to hear directly from people living outside about how they've experienced criminalization and how this case has impacted them. And we know that April 22nd is a moment, but it's part of a broader movement. And we need folks to join with us to say to our elected officials on every level of government, not only stop making homelessness worse by using things like jail cells and fines, but actually do the hard work of governing and fund the housing that ends homelessness.
That's great. Well, Jesse, thank you so much for the work that you do and for taking the time to come here today and talk to us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
If you look through my catalog of videos, you'll see I talk a lot about the issue of homelessness. As we continue to see headline after headline about the growing affordability crisis, how much people are spending on rent, increasing evictions, increasing homelessness, I hope that people will start to come together and build power so that we can fight for a more equal and just society, one that protects those who find themselves on the street rather than punishing them for living in poverty. I so appreciate Jesse Rabinowitz for taking the time to talk with me, and I hope you go follow him on Twitter at Jesser, JESSERBNWTZ. And be sure to follow the National Homelessness Law Center on Twitter as well, at @homeless_law. And if you're in the DC area, maybe I'll see you in front of the court on April 22nd. What do you think? I'd love to know. You can call and leave a voicemail, 657-464-7609, or send an email to idoubitit@dollemore.com. You can support my work by becoming a channel member for as little as $1.99 a month, or head over to Patreon, patreon.com/idoubtitpodcast, whichever is easier for you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.